Oil City, Pennsylvania, a steel-gray autumn morning in 1929. On Grandview Avenue, in a clapboard house that smelled of kielbasa and machine oil, a 12-year-old boy pressed his face against a cold window and watched a biplane scratch across the sky. The boy's name was Franciszek Gabreski, though the teachers at school had already started calling him Francis, because Franciszek was too much to ask of American mouths. His father, Stanley, had come from Częstochowa, Poland, in 1909 with $12 and a willingness to work until his hands bled. He'd found those two things went together in Pennsylvania's oil country. The boy watching the airplane had grown up understanding that America did not give you anything. You took it. You earned it. You proved it, again and again, to everyone in every room who looked at you like you didn't quite belong there yet. He would go on to become the deadliest American fighter pilot in the European theater of World War II. He would shoot down 28 German aircraft in the skies over France, Belgium, and Germany. He would break Eddie Rickenbacker's 26-year-old record and become the face of American air power. His photograph would appear in every newspaper in the country. President Roosevelt would know his name. And then, on July 20th, 1944, a single morning, a single decision, a propeller blade, 6 inches too low, all of it would end. Not in a blaze of glory, not in a screaming dogfight with some brilliant German ace. It would end with a belly landing in a German field, the engine still ticking as it cooled, and a Polish-American boy from Oil City sitting in the grass with his hands in the air. What he built, and how he lost it, and what he built again, that is the story of Francis Gabby Gabreski, and it begins not in the sky, but in the humiliation of almost failing before he ever got there. Before we begin, if you believe the story of America is written by men and women who earned their place the hard way, I invite you to subscribe. This channel is dedicated to telling those stories in full, the victories, the failures, and what came after. If that matters to you, take a moment to subscribe below. It helps keep these histories alive. Now, let's begin in Oil City, Pennsylvania. The son of Polish immigrants in western Pennsylvania inhabited a particular kind of American experience in the 1930s, one defined by the specific weight of being almost but not quite, not black, not quite white, in the way the Anglo-Protestant establishment understood the word. Polish Catholics in Oil City were one rung above the social floor, which meant they could see the ceiling, but were expected to know they'd never reach it. Stanley Gabreski drove his son hard because he understood something his son was still learning, that men who looked like them, who had names like theirs, were not permitted the luxury of being merely adequate. They had to be exceptional, or they were nothing. Francis absorbed this. He was a decent student, a fierce competitor on the school football field, and by the time he graduated from Oil City High School in 1936, he had the kind of compact, concentrated intensity that coaches loved and enemies feared. He enrolled at the University of Notre Dame, nominally to study pre-medicine, but the Depression had drained the family's finances to the bone. He lasted 2 years. Before the money ran out, he came home. He worked. In 1940, with Europe already burning and the U.S. Army Air Corps beginning its desperate expansion, Gabreski enlisted. The Army Air Corps needed pilots. The Army Air Corps would teach you to fly for free. To a 2-year-old with limited options and an enormous chip on his shoulder, this was not just opportunity, it was the specific shape of the thing he had been waiting for without knowing it. Primary flight training. Maxwell Field, Alabama. 1941. This is where the story almost ends before it begins. Every pilot who went through the USAAF training pipeline in those years remembers Maxwell as the Great Sorter. The instructors were merciless, not out of cruelty, but necessity. They were building an air force from nothing, and they didn't have time for sentimentality. You either had it or you didn't, and if you didn't, they told you so and sent you somewhere else. Gabreski's instructor reports from this period describe a pilot who struggled with coordination, who was mechanically awkward in the cockpit, whose landings were inconsistent to the point of being dangerous. One evaluation noted that he demonstrated difficulty maintaining orientation in turns. a damning phrase in a pilot's training file. There were discussions, later documented in his own memoir, about washing him out entirely, sending him back to Oil City. In Gabby, A Fighter Pilot's Life, his 1991 autobiography written with Carl Molesworth, Gabreski describes sitting in his bunk at Maxwell and doing math in his head, not aerodynamics, not navigation, the mathematics of humiliation. If he washed out, he went home. If he went home, he was Stanley Gabreski's son, who couldn't make it. He was the Polish kid from Grandview Avenue, who almost played in the big leagues. He was the story that other Oil City boys told at the VFW Hall, as a cautionary tale. He did not wash out, but it was close. What saved him, and this is critical to understanding everything that comes later, was not sudden natural talent. It was pure, grinding, relentless repetition. He flew until his hands stopped shaking. He flew until the instrument scan became automatic. He flew until the airplane stopped being a machine he was fighting and started being something he inhabited. It took longer than it should have. It cost him more than it cost others, and he never forgot that. By the time he earned his wings and his commission as a second lieutenant, in April 1941, he was a good pilot. Not remarkable. Good. The kind of pilot the Army Air Corps needed in large quantities to fill out squadrons. He was assigned to a fighter unit in Hawaii, was at Wheeler Field on December 7, 1941. A morning that required no further introduction, and watched the Japanese fill the sky over Pearl Harbor, while American planes burned in neat rows below. He survived Pearl Harbor by being on the ground and being lucky. A lot of men survived Pearl Harbor that way, but the experience burned something into him that would shape the rest of his combat career. The particular rage of the man who was present at his side's greatest humiliation, and helpless to stop it. Some men who feel that way spend the rest of their lives running from it. Gabreski spent the rest of his life trying to pay it back, with interest. In 1942, through a combination of his documented fluency in Polish and the Army Air Corps' need for liaison officers who could work with Allied forces, Gabreski was attached to the RAF's 315 Polish Fighter Squadron, Division 315, operating out of Northolt, England. He flew Spitfires. He flew combat missions over occupied Europe. He flew with men who had escaped Poland on foot ahead of the German advance, who had lost families to the occupation, who fought with the particular ferocity of men who had nothing left to lose, except the chance to make the Germans pay. He didn't get any kills. He flew dozens of missions and came home every time and didn't kill anyone. But something happened to him in those months with the Polish squadron that no flight manual could have produced. He watched how the RAF and Polish pilots used their aircraft, the way they read a fight, the way they thought 3 moves ahead, the way they survived against an enemy who had been killing for 3 years while the Americans were still learning what the war actually was. He came back to the American system, back to the USAAF, having absorbed something he couldn't quite articulate. He had been to school, real school. In early 1943, he was assigned to the 56th Fighter Group, stationed at Halesworth in Suffolk, England. The group was commanded by a lean, angular man from Montana named Hub Zemke, Hubert A. Zemke, one of the best tactical minds in the American Air War, and a man who would spend the rest of his life not getting quite enough credit for it. The 56th Fighter Group flew the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, and when Gabreski walked out on the flight line at Halesworth for the first time and looked at the machine that would define the rest of his life, his first reaction was not awe. It was something closer to recognition. The P-47 was enormous, 18 feet from spinner to tail, 14 feet tall, weighing more than 7 tons fully loaded. Fighter pilots called it the Jug, short for Juggernaut, and some of them said it with affection, and some of them said it with the particular tone men use for things they don't entirely trust. It was the biggest, heaviest, single-engine fighter the USAAF flew. It was not elegant. It did not suggest grace. Gabreski looked at it and understood something immediately that not every pilot grasped. The P-47 was not trying to be a Spitfire. It was not trying to be a Zero. It was not asking for your approval. It was built for a specific kind of fight, at a specific kind of altitude, against a specific kind of enemy, and if you tried to make it be something it wasn't, it would kill you. But if you understood what it was, if you let it be itself, there was nothing in the sky over Europe that could touch it. He had just spent months with the Polish squadron, watching men die because they tried to make their aircraft fight the enemy's fight. He had no intention of making that mistake. Halesworth, Suffolk, England. Spring 1943. The 56th Fighter Group is learning its trade. Hub Zemke ran his group the way a demanding professor runs a graduate seminar, with the expectation that the students were serious people who could handle hard information delivered directly. He did not coddle. He did not explain things twice, and he had no patience for pilots who came to him with theories that hadn't been tested in the air, which meant that the fastest way to earn his respect was to test your theory and come back alive to report the results. Gabreski had arrived at the 56th, already possessing something the purely American-trained pilots lacked. He'd seen real war. He'd watched what happened when you made a mistake against a German pilot who had been killing since 1939. He was not scared of the Germans. He was scared of underestimating them, which is a more productive kind of fear. The tactical problem facing every American P-47 pilot in early 1943 was a painful one: the Focke-Wulf 100 and the Messerschmitt 109G. The principal German fighters they would face over the skies of Western Europe were in most low to medium altitude, respects the equal of, or superior to the Thunderbolt. The FFW 190 in particular was a sensational aircraft, tight-turning, fast in a horizontal fight, armed to the teeth. At altitudes below 2,000 feet, the Germans had real advantages. German pilots were experienced, tactically sophisticated, and were fighting over or near friendly territory, meaning a German pilot who bailed out was back in the fight within days, while an American who went down was in a prison camp. There was, however, a ceiling on German dominance. The Focke-Wulf 190 used an air-cooled BMW 801 radial engine that began losing power significantly above 25,000 feet. The Messerschmitt 109G, while better at altitude than the 190, still struggled above 30,000. The Thunderbolt's Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, paired with a General Electric turbo supercharger that compressed thinning air back into the intake, produced 2,000 horsepower at 27,000 feet. Effectively the same power it produced at sea level. At altitude, the Thunderbolt was in a different league. The problem was getting there and staying there, and forcing the Germans to fight you on your terms rather than theirs. Gabreski worked this out with the particular thoroughness of a man who had nearly washed out of flight school, and therefore never took anything for granted. He flew to altitude. He practiced high-altitude maneuvering until his hands moved without conscious thought. He developed what he would later describe as a sense of altitude as currency. Height was money, and you never spent it unless you were sure of the return. Where other pilots sometimes dived into a fight out of eagerness or aggression, Gabreski held his altitude. He circled. He watched. He waited until the geometry was precisely right, and then he pointed the nose down and came in with the full accumulated energy of 27,000 feet of potential combat power. The P-47, in a dive, was a revelation. 7 tons of airplane accelerating down at over 500 miles per hour. Most German pilots, when they saw the attack coming, would brake hard and try to force the American into a turning fight they knew they could win. But here was the thing about the Thunderbolt that took time to appreciate. It could roll at high speed with a fluency that belied its size. Gabreski could initiate a rolling pullout from a high-speed dive and be repositioning for another attack before a German pilot in an FFW 190 had finished completing his defensive break. He called it the overhead pass. You came down from above and behind at high speed, and you didn't try to turn with the enemy. You made one pass, fired, and climbed back up before they could reverse on you. It required absolute confidence in your judgment of deflection shooting, because you had seconds, not minutes. It required trusting the Thunderbolt's ability to survive whatever return fire you might walk through during the attack. And it required the psychological discipline not to stay and mix it up when you had a damaged aircraft in front of you, because the temptation to finish the kill could get you killed yourself. These were not casual insights. These were lessons learned in blood, some of it German, some of it belonging to 56th Fighter Group pilots who hadn't figured out the calculus fast enough. August 24th, 1943. The skies over Flushing, on the southwestern tip of the Netherlands, at approximately 0920 hours local time. Gabreski was leading a flight of 4 Thunderbolts at 26,000 feet when German radar vectored a formation of FW-190s up to intercept. What happened next lasted perhaps 90 seconds and would be reconstructed from his combat report, gun camera footage, and later accounts in his memoir. 2 Focke-Wulfs, apparently unaware of the Americans above them, were climbing in a loose formation directly through Gabreski's firing solution. He rolled the Thunderbolt inverted, held the nose down through the split S, and came in from behind and above in a 30-degree diving pass. The first burst, perhaps 40 rounds from all 8.50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, struck the leading FFW 190 across the engine cowling and cockpit at a combined closing speed of over 400 knots. The Focke-Wulf came apart in a way that combat pilots describe in the same clinical language every time, because there are only so many ways to describe a machine becoming wreckage while still traveling at 200 miles per hour. He was already climbing back before the first German hit the water. He brought the nose around and found the second FW 190 in a climbing turn, the German pilot clearly aware now of what had happened to his wingman and trying to reverse. Gabreski cut the angle, fired a deflection burst at 90 degrees to the German's flight path, and watched the rounds walk through the fuselage. The second FW 190 rolled inverted and went down trailing smoke. 2 kills, 1 attack sequence, 90 seconds. He wrote in his official combat report that afternoon, with a careful understatement of a professional, 2 enemy aircraft destroyed, no damage to own aircraft. What he wrote in his diary was different. I think I understand this airplane now. He did. And the Germans were about to begin understanding that too. Through the fall of 1943, Gabreski's kill total climbed steadily. Each victory was distinct, earned against competent opponents. JG-2, 6 Abbeville boys, JG-2 Richthofen, elite Luftwaffe units that had been killing Allied pilots since 1940. He flew with the intensity of a man keeping score against something larger than aerial combat, against every instructor at Maxwell who had doubted him, against every teacher who had mangled his name, against the specific weight of being the son of immigrants in a country that required you to earn your place in it each morning before breakfast. Hub Zemke watched this and understood it. The 2 men had a relationship that defies easy categorization. Zemke was the commanding officer and Gabreski the subordinate, but they were both complex men with strong opinions, and neither was the type to pretend otherwise. Zemke appreciated Gabreski's tactical intelligence, his physical courage, and his ability to function with precision under conditions that reduced other men to improvisation. He also, according to accounts from other 56 FG pilots, recognized something in Gabreski's aggression that required managing, a tendency, when the fight was going well, to extend the engagement beyond what the math of survival supported. Robert S. Johnson was also flying with the 56th FG during these months, accumulating kills of his own, building the reputation that would eventually make him the most publicly recognized American ace in Europe. Johnson and Gabreski were not rivals in any bitter sense. They respected each other, flew together, covered each other's tails. But they were measuring the same thing against themselves and against each other, and both men knew it. Johnson was, by most accounts, a more naturally gifted pilot in terms of raw flying instinct. Gabreski was more analytically rigorous, more patient, more capable of the kind of cold-eyed tactical calculation that produced consistent results against consistent opposition. The distinction mattered, and it would matter even more in the killing winter of early 1944. February 1944, the combined bomber offensive reaches a culmination that would later be called Big Week, 6 days of massive strategic bombing against the heart of German aircraft manufacturing. It is the moment when the American air war in Europe stops being a war of attrition and starts being a systematic dismantling of German industrial capacity. And at the center of it, flying escort mission after escort mission in weather that should have grounded everyone, is Gabreski. February 20th, 1944. Gabreski leads a flight of Thunderbolts escorting B-17 Flying Fortresses over Leipzig at 25,000 feet. The German response is fierce. JG-3 and JG-WII. 5-1 vectored in by ground radar, attempting to break up the bomber formations before they can reach the target. The sky fills with contrails and tracers, and the slow, terrible smoke of burning aircraft. And in the middle of it, Gabreski works his altitude discipline with mechanical precision, coming down out of the sun, firing, climbing, repositioning. 2 kills on February 20th, another on the 22nd. The kill total climbs past 15, past 18, past 20. The press is beginning to notice. The story writes itself. The Polish-American kid from Pennsylvania, flying the biggest fighter in the USAAF, knocking Germans out of the sky with a cold efficiency that the newspapers find simultaneously admirable and slightly unnerving. The 56th Fighter Group is the top-scoring American fighter group in Europe. Hub Zemke is a well-known name in aviation circles. Robert Johnson is becoming famous in the popular press. And Gabreski, who by April 1944 is the leading American ace in the European theater, is getting the kind of attention that requires a man to make decisions about who he wants to be in public. Decisions that are different from and harder than the decisions he makes in the cockpit. Eddie Rickenbacker had shot down 26 German aircraft in World War I, a record that had stood for 26 years and had achieved the particular weight of a national monument. Breaking it meant something to the country in a specific way, and the press covered Gabreski's approach to the record the way sports reporters cover a home run record in its final weeks. 22 kills, 23, 24, May 1944. The invasion of Europe is weeks away, though no one outside of the highest Allied command knows the date. The Luftwaffe is dying by inches, not because the Germans are cowardly or incompetent, but because the mathematics of industrial war have turned against them with a finality that no tactical skill can reverse. German pilot training has been compressed from months to weeks as the losses mount. American pilot training has actually improved. More hours, better instructors, better aircraft for initial training. The gap in quality is still manageable for the Germans. The gap in quantity is not. Gabreski understands this intellectually. He can read the numbers, what the numbers don't tell him, and what no intelligence briefing can quantify is the specific mixture of exhilaration and dread that comes with flying your 28th escort mission over Germany, knowing that the statistical odds of surviving are declining with each sortie, and feeling at the same time more alive in the cockpit than anywhere else on Earth. He writes in his memoir about this period with a clarity that is striking precisely because he never romanticizes it. He loved aerial combat. Not the death, not the specific human cost that he was careful to acknowledge, but the combat itself, the pure kinetic problem of it. The way flying in a P-47 at altitude, with enemies in the frame, was the one circumstance in which the entirety of his ability was fully in play. June 12, 1944, 6 days after D-Day, with Allied ground forces fighting to expand the Normandy bridgehead, Gabreski downed his 27th and 28th kills, 2 Focke-Wulf 190s over France, and became the leading American ace in Europe, passing Rickenbacker's record. The press response was immediate and enormous. Photographs on the front pages of newspapers across America. Gabreski in his cockpit, in his flight gear, standing in front of his P-47 with its row of kill markings on the fuselage. The immigrant's son from Oil City had done the thing the country needed done, in the way the country needed it done. But Gabreski was already scheduled to rotate home. His combat tour was ending. The Army Air Forces had strict rotation policies for experienced pilots. Too many had been lost trying to squeeze one more mission out of a tour, and the USAAF needed surviving aces back in the States for training. Public relations, bombed tours, all the machinery of a country at total war. He had one, perhaps two missions left before he was on a boat home. Robert Johnson, watching this from close proximity, would later describe Gabreski during these final weeks as a man in the grip of something that went beyond normal combat aggression. Not recklessness, exactly. Gabreski was too methodical for simple recklessness, but a kind of driven intensity that was, Johnson thought, partly about the record, and partly about something harder to name. The ambition that had carried him from Maxwell Field to the top of the American kill list in Europe was not an ambition that switched off cleanly at the end of a tour. It was the engine he ran on, and the engine was still running when it should have been cooling down. On July 19th, 1944, Gabreski flew what he expected to be his last combat mission. It was uneventful. He came home. He should have been done. July 20th, 1944, 56th Fighter Group, Halesworth, Suffolk. Morning briefing, 0630 hours. The mission is a fighter sweep and ground attack into Western Germany. Standard fare in the summer of 1944, as Allied air forces increasingly targeted German ground infrastructure, transportation, and airfields. Gabreski is not supposed to be on this mission. His rotation date has effectively arrived, but he has volunteered for one more sortie, one more flight, before his feet leave English soil. He has offered various explanations for this decision over the years, and they are each probably partly true. He wanted to say goodbye to the war properly. He wanted one more chance to add to his score. He was, in the most fundamental sense, a man who did not know how to stop when the opportunity to keep going was still available. The chip on the shoulder from Oil City does not calculate risk the way a man without something to prove would calculate it. His Thunderbolt is armed and fueled. His crew chief has signed off on the aircraft. The mission briefing covers targets, weather, radio procedures, emergency fields. He has done this so many times that the briefing is background music. He is already in the cockpit in his mind, already at altitude, already looking for the fight. The formation crosses the English Channel at 15,000 feet, descends toward the Rhine Valley. The weather is clear, a high-pressure system that has been sitting over Western Europe for days, which is helpful for navigation and visibility, and disastrous for a pilot trying to get home alive, because clear weather means radar works perfectly, and every German in the sector knows where you are. The primary targets for ground attack are German airfields in the Koblenz area. Gabreski has strafed airfields before. It is one of the most dangerous missions a fighter pilot can fly, because at low altitude, doing 350 miles per hour across a defended airfield, the margin for error is measured in feet, and the return fire from even light anti-aircraft guns is devastating. Veteran pilots treat airfield strafing with the specific respect you give a loaded weapon with the safety off. Gabreski finds the airfield at Bassenheim, a German Luftwaffe dispersal field near Koblenz, and brings his Thunderbolt down for the attack. The approach is standard: come in low and fast. Below the gun's effective engagement altitude, hit the parked aircraft on the ramp, get out before they can react. He makes his first pass at 50 feet. He can see German aircraft in the revetments, Heinkel 111S probably, or possibly Junkers 52 transports, parked in neat rows like targets on a range. His guns are firing. Tracers walking across the tarmac, and he is already pulling up when he realizes that his nose is lower than he thought, that the gentle undulation of the terrain he was using as a reference has given him a false picture of his actual altitude. The propeller, the massive four-bladed Curtiss electric paddle prop of a P-47D, clips the ground, not the landing gear, not the belly, the propeller, at 350 miles per hour, at the precise moment when Gabreski is beginning his pullout. In his memoir, he describes the sensation as a sudden shuddering through the entire airframe, a vibration so violent that for a fraction of a second he thought the engine had exploded. The propeller blades are bent back. 3 of the 4 blades have struck the earth and folded forward, against the nose cowling. The engine, suddenly unbalanced by the catastrophic damage to its propeller, is producing vibrations measured in tons of force per second. Gabreski cuts the throttle. He cuts the mixture. He does the thing that training has drilled into him for years. He attempts a controlled crash. The P-47, 7 tons of airplane without a propeller, slides across a German field in a shower of sparks and torn metal and earth. It travels perhaps 300 meters before it stops. The left wing hits a rise in the ground and swings the aircraft around. The cockpit is intact. The fuel tanks miraculously do not ignite. The engine is cooling. The field is quiet. And then, in the silence, Gabreski can hear the thunderbolts of his formation making a second pass overhead. His wingmen, still looking for ground targets, unaware that their leader is sitting in the wreckage below them. He climbs out of the cockpit. The Thunderbolt is smoking but not burning. He is unhurt. He stands in a German field in his USAF flight gear, his leather jacket, his oxygen mask around his neck, his .45 on his hip, and looks at the remains of the machine that made him the deadliest American fighter pilot in Europe, and he knows with absolute certainty that the war is over for him. He evaded for several hours, moving through the farmland east of the Rhine, his immediate instinct, trained into every American airman, to put distance between himself and the aircraft, reach a wood line, find a hiding place, wait for darkness. But this is July, deep inside Germany, and there are people everywhere who have been looking up for 3 years, watching their cities burn. He was picked up by German soldiers before nightfall, processed by Luftwaffe intelligence officers who recognized his name immediately from their own files, and transported to the prisoner of war system. His 28th kill remained his last. For the rest of 1944 and into 1945, as the most important months of the European air war unfolded above him, as the Allied armies crossed the Rhine and drove toward Berlin, as the Luftwaffe dissolved from an air force into scattered fragments of what it had been, Gabreski sat in Stalag Luft 1 at Bath, on the Baltic coast of Germany. He was not there as a civilian, not as a non-combatant. He was there as a prisoner of war, an officer entitled to the protections of the Geneva Convention, in a camp that housed thousands of Allied airmen, ranging from privates to generals. Stalag Luft I was, by the standards of German prisoner of war camps, not inhumane. The Red Cross inspected it. The food was adequate in a narrow, caloric sense. The prisoners maintained their military organization. Senior officers commanded their own sections of the camp, ran their own internal discipline, ran escape committees that planned constantly and succeeded occasionally. The Luftwaffe commandant, a First World War veteran named Colonel von Warnstedt, was by most accounts a correct if not friendly man who observed the forms of the convention. None of this made it bearable in any emotional sense. What Stalag Luft I was, for a man like Gabreski, was a prison of enforced irrelevance. Outside the wire, the war he had spent 2 years mastering was being won or lost without him. He had been at the top of the profession, and then, 6 inches of altitude on a strafing run he didn't need to make, he was reduced to walking the compound perimeter, playing cards, reading whatever books the Red Cross managed to send, and listening to the BBC broadcasts that filtered through despite German jamming. He was not the senior officer in the camp. He was not even the most famous prisoner, because in September 1944, 2 months after Gabreski's capture, Hub Zemke himself was shot down over Germany. His P-51 lost its tail in a storm and tumbled out of control, and Zemke arrived at Stalag Luft I to find his former wingman already in residence. There is a quality to this reunion, described in Zemke's own memoir, Zemke's Wolf Pack, that is simultaneously absurd and deeply poignant. The 2 best combat leaders of the 56th Fighter Group, the men who had built the top-scoring American fighter unit in Europe, sitting together in a German prison camp, playing chess and reading month-old newspapers while the war they'd built ended without them. Zemke characteristically organized. He took command of the American officer section of the camp, established order, maintained military discipline. For him, the camp was a different kind of war, with different weapons and different rules. Gabreski, who was a fighter pilot and not an administrator, found the organizational work less compelling. He walked. He thought. He ran when the guards allowed it, around the compound perimeter, the same compact grinding repetition that had got him through Maxwell Field in 1941. The worst of it, he would say later, was the news, not the bombing reports or the casualty statistics. Those he could compartmentalize because casualties were abstract, but the specific operational news that filtered in, missions he would have led, kills that should have been his. The 56th Fighter Group continued to fight, continued to succeed, and the credit accumulated around names that were not his. One name in particular. Robert Johnson had left the 56th FG in May 1944, before Gabreski's capture, having run his own kill total to 27, briefly making him the top American ace in the European theater before Gabreski surpassed him in June. Johnson went home on rotation. He wrote his memoir. He gave interviews. He was handsome and charismatic and knew how to talk to a reporter, and the American press, which needed faces to put on the air war, gave him the face they were looking for. While Gabreski sat at Bath, Robert Johnson became America's top ace. The coverage was not inaccurate exactly. Johnson had indeed, for a period of time, held the top score in the ETO, and the press covered the period it knew about. But Gabreski had surpassed him and then been shot down, and the narrative had moved on without him. By the time he came home, the story had already been told, and it had been told with someone else as the protagonist. He never said much about this publicly. The few times he addressed it directly, he was careful and measured and gave Johnson every credit that was due. But the people who knew him, the men who had flown with him and who saw him in the months after liberation, could read the particular kind of quiet that settles over a man who has been passed over by history through circumstances that were, in the final accounting, partly his own fault. He had volunteered for that last mission. He had flown too low. He knew it. He would spend the rest of his life knowing it. The camp was liberated on May 1st, 1945, the Russian army advancing from the east, von Warnstedt surrendering the facility, rather than fight for it. Gabreski walked out of Stalag Luft I as a lieutenant colonel. He had been promoted in absentia, 10 months older than the day he had put his Thunderbolt down in that German field. The war in Europe, 5 days from its formal end. He flew home by transport, sat in the back of a C-54, and watched the Atlantic pass beneath him, and thought about what came next. The America that Gabreski came home to in the summer of 1945 was doing what America does at the end of wars, processing victory into narrative, turning the complex reality of 5 years of organized killing into a set of stories that the country could hold on to. Some men fit that process smoothly. Others found that the story the country had already decided on had limited room for revision. Gabreski discovered that he was famous. His record, his story, his face were known, but famous in a way that was already becoming past tense. He was the top American ace of the European theater of World War II. He had 28 kills. These facts were available in any reference book, and in his case the reference books were accurate, and that was more than most men could say. But the living, breathing, ongoing public representation of American air power in Europe, the man whose face came to mind when people thought of the P-47 and the 56th and the air war over Germany, was someone else. He re-entered the Air Force as a career officer and waited for the next war the way a craftsman waits for the next commission. He had discovered, at Maxwell Field in 1941, and in every year since, that he was a man who defined himself entirely by what he could do in the air. Without the war, without the enemy, without the mission, the definition lost its clarity. Korea gave it back. By 1951, the United States Air Force, the independent service, split from the Army in 1947, was fighting the first jet war over the Yalu River, where American F-86 Sabres engaged Soviet-built MiG-15s. flown by North Korean, Chinese, and though officially denied at the time, Soviet pilots. The MiG-15 was a formidable aircraft, fast climbing, hard turning, with heavy 23 mm and 37 mm cannon armament that could destroy a Sabre with a single hit. The Sabre pilots who went to Korea in 1951 faced something genuinely new, not the comfortable familiarity of an adversary they had defeated before, but an aircraft and a tactical philosophy that required everything they knew to be questioned and rebuilt. Gabreski arrived in Korea in June 1951 as commanding officer of the 51st Fighter Interceptor Wing. He was 33 years old. He had been out of combat for 7 years. He had the institutional memory of a man who had spent the most important years of his professional life in a prison camp, while the world of combat aviation evolved beyond him. He adapted, and between 1951 and 1952, flying the FSA Sabre against MiG-15s over MiG Alley along the Yalu, he shot down 6.5 enemy aircraft, the 0.5 being a shared kill, confirmed by gun camera footage, making him a double ace across 2 wars and 2 different generations of aviation technology. His first MiG kill came on July 8, 1951, barely 2 weeks after arriving in theatre. He brought the F-86 down from altitude in a diving attack, came in from the MiG's 7 o'clock, and fired a 1-second burst from the Sabre's 6.50 calibers that sent the MiG-15 into an uncontrolled roll from which it did not recover. The angle of attack was almost identical to the overhead pass he had developed in the P-47 8 years earlier. The enemy was different, the machine was different, the man was the same. 6.5 MiG kills over Korea brought his total aerial victories to 34.5, more than any other American pilot in the jet age, and more than any American pilot in history, except for the World War II aces, who had the numerical advantages of a larger air war to rack up higher totals. The Air Force recognized this, with promotions, with the Silver Star, with assignments to positions of increasing responsibility. The general public, which had moved on from the Second World War and was processing Korea as a different, less satisfying kind of conflict, was less focused on the accounting. He retired from the Air Force in 1967 as a full colonel after 26 years of service. He had commanded wings, trained pilots, participated in the institutional debates about air power doctrine that shaped the Cold War Air Force. He had done the work. He had been present. His record, all of it, the P-47 kills, and the MiG kills, and the prison camp, and the recovery, was in the files. In 1991, he published Gabby, a Fighter Pilot's Life, with Carl Molesworth. It was his attempt to put the record straight in his own words, to tell the full story, including the Maxwell near washout, and the Bassenheim crash, and the prison camp, and Korea. The book was well-reviewed and genuinely illuminating. Gabreski wrote about himself with a directness that most men of his generation, shaped by the military culture of the 1940s and 1950s, could not manage. He was honest about his failures. He was honest about his drives and their costs. He was honest about the July 20th mission, in a way that went beyond simple admission. He said essentially that he had been pushing past the edge of what was safe because he was constitutionally incapable of stopping when stopping was still an option. He didn't frame it as a character flaw, he framed it as who he was, which may be the most honest framing available. He died on January 31st, 2002, in Huntington, New York. He was 83 years old. He had been married to his wife Kay for decades, had children and grandchildren, had lived the kind of long civilian life that was the whole point of surviving combat, even when the combat was the part you lived most fully. His P-47D, the one he flew during the peak of his 1944 kill run, the one with the kill markings on the cowling, is not intact. It was not preserved, and it was not recovered. Most of the Thunderbolts from the 56th Fighter Group ended their days the way most combat aircraft end theirs, used up and scrapped when the mission was over. But his name is on the memorial at Halesworth, where the 56th Fighter Group flew. It is on the wall at the National Air and Space Museum. It is in the records at the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell Field, Alabama, the same Maxwell Field where an instructor once considered washing him out of flight training, the same Maxwell where the records of his near failure sit next to the records of everything he accomplished afterward. The P-47 Thunderbolt, that was his instrument and his undoing, is preserved in the form of survivors. 12, perhaps 15, still exist in various states of completion and restoration. The best of them, fully airworthy, can be heard at air shows from time to time. The sound of the R-2800 at full power is a physical experience. A deep percussion that you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. The sound a machine makes when it is doing exactly what it was built to do, at the altitude and speed and purpose it was built for. There is a question this documentary has been circling since the beginning, and it is time to answer it, or to admit that it cannot be answered cleanly. Was Francis Gabreski a genius who got unlucky? Or was he a man whose aggression finally outran his judgment? The honest answer is both, simultaneously, inseparably. The aggression that drove him from Oil City to the top of the American kill list in Europe was the same aggression that put him 50 feet over a German airfield on a mission he didn't need to fly. On the last day he was supposed to be a combat pilot, he could not be what he was, in the air, precise, relentless, brilliant at high altitude, without also being what he was at low altitude on July 20th, 1944, a man for whom stopping was physiologically impossible when the target was still available. That is the line, not between courage and recklessness, but between the qualities that make a great fighter pilot and the qualities that cost a great fighter pilot everything. The line is thin, and it moves, and the men who spend their lives on one side of it and not the other are luckier than they are smarter. What is not in question, what the records and the testimonies and the kill markings and the career mission reports all confirm, without ambiguity, is the caliber of the man. He flew in 2 wars, in 2 generations of aircraft, against 2 different generations of enemies, and killed them in both, and he did it after nearly washing out of flight school, after spending 10 months in a German prison camp, after coming home to discover that the story had been told without him. He did it because the thing that drove him, that specific Polish-American chip-on-the-shoulder refusal to be adequate, was not a feature he could turn off. It was the engine, and the engine ran until the end. On April 8, 1943, the month before Gabreski's first aerial kill, the month he was just arriving at the 56th Fighter Group and beginning to understand the P-47, an Oberleutnant of JG 26 looked across the sky over France at a formation of ascending American fighters and radioed to his wingman that they had sent them flying milk bottles. By July of 1944, every German fighter pilot in the Western Theater had updated that assessment. By May of 1945, most of the men who had composed it were dead, and the sky over Europe belonged to the Americans. Gabreski did not see VE Day from the air. He saw it from the ground, walking out of a prison camp on the Baltic coast of Germany. The war over, the record complete, the story his to carry forward into whatever came next. He carried it well. He carried it far. He earned, over time, the recognition that the press coverage of 1944 and 1945 had redistributed elsewhere. He is remembered now, in the books, in the records, in the hangar at Halesworth, where his name is carved, as what he was, the deadliest American fighter pilot in the European theater of the Second World War, a double ace across 2 wars, a man who was almost ordinary and chose not to be. Oil City, Pennsylvania, produced a Polish immigrant's son who reached the top of the most unforgiving profession of the most destructive war in human history. He flew through it at 27,000 feet, with 8 guns, and everything to prove, and he proved it in the only language that war speaks: numbers, velocity, gravity, and the cold efficiency of a man who had learned to make the machine do exactly what the moment required. That boy on Grandview Avenue, watching the biplane scratch across the Pennsylvania sky in 1929, could not have imagined any of it. But he reached for it anyway. And the reaching, the refusal to stop, even when stopping was the reasonable choice, is either the story of greatness or a cautionary tale about the cost of ambition, depending entirely on which morning you're reading it. Perhaps both. Perhaps that's the point. Perhaps that's Gabreski's final lesson, delivered from 27,000 feet over Germany in 1944, and from a prison camp on the Baltic, and from a jet cockpit over the Yalu River 3 years later, delivered to anyone still paying attention. The engine doesn't have a governor. The altitude is always currency, and the sky, in the end, is perfectly indifferent to what you deserve.